This series is made possible by the generous donation of Stifel Financial and viewers like you. Thank you.
So my name is Robert Womack. I work for the town of Truckee. I'm the emergency services coordinator. I have been tasked with that for about a year and a half. However, I've been doing emergency management for about 35 years. So this is kind of the twilight of my career, but all of a sudden it became brand new with a really renewed emphasis on wildfires. And truthfully, in emergency management, we're all hazards. We're focused on wildfires. If we know how to deal with those, we'll be able to deal with all the other stuff that goes on. I grew up in Truckee, moved off the hill and went to San Jose State. And my first major event that I dealt with was the Loma Prieta earthquake. And people often remember that was when the Giants and the A's were playing and everybody wound up in the middle of the stadium. And so that was kind of my first into emergency management. I came back when the Truckee Police Department started in 2001, and so I spent 17 or so years working patrol on all sorts of different assignments in law enforcement, but I also did emergency management as a ancillary duty. And the town, recently realizing the significance of this, has assigned me full-time to that. So we have a lot of different things, and that's the county, because of the Sierra Crest, is really split into two sections. And when you talk about Truckee, it's the town of Truckee, Truckee Fire Protection District, and CAL FIRE, with a lot of other resources. Firewise, we have a very active Firewise community in our Tahoe Donner subdivision. We've recently brought one online in our Glenshire subdivision, and we're looking at bringing a couple more Firewise communities on up there. So there's the services like that where the Firewise people come out and help start working with people, figuring out how to do defensible space. We also have a really strong green waste program. We have curbside green waste containers. You can pick up the dumpsters, and if you set those up ahead of time through our recycling program. And then we also have drop-off points at different times of the year. Now, obviously, we're a little bit later in the year. It'll go into the end of May and early June as we start doing a lot of that green waste cleanup. But we're really pushing people to think about defensible space this year and what can they do to harden their house to make their property safer for a fire season that really is never ending. So that creates a really interesting dynamic. The population base, depending on what time of year it is and holiday weekends, things like that, summertime versus wintertime, it's running anywhere from 50 to 75% of our population is going to be second homeowners or tourists, who we know from studies only spend 2 to 3 nights a year up there. So the likelihood that they have any idea of what we're talking about, where they're at, where their home is at, is very difficult. So some of the things we've done, one of our subdivisions, the Tahoe Donner subdivision, is predominantly tourist-based, about 80 to 85% of it. So we're working very closely with their Community Homeowners Association to push out on every media channel we can, their monthly newsletters, their email blast, their paper, traditional media, and making sure that they get the message of places they can go to for information. And like everybody else, we're really trying to make them understand that those days when you hear that the weather is going to be something to deal with fire, that you need to be paying attention even though you're on vacation. And we all go on vacation, and I'm as guilty as anybody else. I go on vacation and I want to forget about this stuff. But you can't totally forget about it. You got to be aware. When you're talking about the tourist-based, that's a lot of Nevada County has, with the gold history and all the 49er stuff, and there's a lot of people that come up here, they recreate in the Tahoe National Forest. How do you get a hold of somebody who's in a campsite and may have a wildfire bearing down on them? And so it's not something where it's just Truckee, although we obviously are very well aware of it. But a lot of it has to do with how do we notify any tourist, anybody that doesn't really, and as we move to a society that is more global, what do we do as we run into people who don't speak the language that is maybe a traditional English language, and how do we make sure they understand the seriousness? And some of that is what we're working with now with the wireless alert system. And so we're going to be able to reach out and touch phones, but if I'm telling somebody in a very short message, 100 characters or less, how to evacuate or the need to evacuate, I have to be very specific, or the potential to create not so much panic, but just unmanageable amounts of people leaving that didn't need to leave is our problem. Yeah, sirens are a very interesting dynamic. They work really well in places like tornadoes and tsunamis where it's a very defined type of risk. One of the best places they work is actually around the nuclear plants. Because if you hear the siren, you know it's a nuclear plant and you know what you're going to do. And we train a very stable population on what the response is. One of the problems that happened in Hawaii, and they found this out during the accidental alert, is that they set off all the sirens and everybody thought a tsunami was coming, and really it was a ballistic missile test. And so the siren didn't mean what it should have meant. And we face that problem in that we're an all hazards risk. We have a rail line, we have a pipeline, we have an interstate, we have earthquake faults throughout our county, but specifically to the Truckee area. And if we have a siren sound, what does that mean to somebody? And so that's the first problem that we face. And we talked about the amount of tourism we have. Does a tourist even know what a siren means in terms of how do we train that into a very transient population? The other thing that comes out, particularly in a mountainous area, it takes a lot of sirens, very high-powered sirens, very costly to make the system work, and it runs off the same technology that our wireless phones run off of, which leaves us with, if the wireless phone didn't work, the siren may not work either. So this is a very difficult, lot of research has to go into how the best way to handle it is. And in the end, do we want to try everything we can? And that's certainly probably where it comes down to. We're talking about somewhere, I talked to the national rep for one of the companies, about 30 sirens in Truckee would be necessary just for Truckee, at about 25,000 to 30,000 a piece. Well, and there is cost is a factor because that's money we're taking from somewhere else. And so that's one of the things that we look at is, can we use that money that we would spend on a siren system to do something else that is more beneficial? One of the things we are looking at is using basically our car sirens, changing the tone and using our non-sworn personnel to drive through neighborhoods and use the sirens off the cars. There's a couple of different ways to do some of this stuff that may allow us to take and leverage that money that we otherwise would have spent on a siren and try and leverage it on something else that might be more important to the community. Do we use it on changeable message signboards? Do we use it on buying low power AM transmitter stations? There's discussion now with the FCC and allow us to use high power during emergencies. But we have to fund all that. So as we start talking about all these kind of different things that we can put money towards, would it be great to take that money and maybe use it for defensible space? And does it have a better value? This is where it gets very tough, and those discussions become really difficult because there is no amount of money that's worth a life. There's no question about that. So we have two really strong volunteer programs in Truckee, and they're similar to most areas. The West Side has exactly the same kind of things. The Community Emergency Response Team, CERT, which is usually run through the fire departments, but not always. And then in our case, we have the Volunteers in Policing, which the sheriffs have the senior volunteers also, and they're kind of the same idea. And we use those groups for all sorts of different things. And when it comes to an emergency situation, they probably will not be out doing notifications, but they're going to be the ones behind the scenes helping us try and run this whole thing, and all of the staffing and all the other things that happen. One of the biggest things that we're working with our volunteers is they all live in our communities. And so what we tell them is they're probably more aware than most people of things that are going on. And if they hear that it's time to evacuate, we want them to go knock on a couple of doors, make sure their neighbors know to go. Kind of like you talked about with the tourists, we're just reinforcing that message that they're hearing. And everybody get out, we'll regroup and figure out what we can do. There's certainly tons of ways to volunteer within any community. One of the things about disaster response plans, and it's been said before, but it really bears repeating, is a lot of disaster response plans are for the government, continuity of operations, how we're going to continue providing services. Those are what those plans ultimately a lot of times focus on. You know, people are looking for, well, what's the evacuation plan? Well, we have an evacuation guide for the town, and it's available on our police department website that lists the major roads with the idea of getting people to our interstate that runs through there and out of the area, likely to Reno or Sacramento, because we just probably don't in a large scale. And really we have to make the differentiation between the kind of Paradise, Campfire, Thomas Fire, Mega Fire, and what is really more likely that we're going to see, at least initially, which is something much smaller. And so we're trying to, as we deal with this, we want to get people out of those areas, get them onto the interstate, and that's what our evacuation guides are for. And that's really what people are probably more interested in. They don't really care what position I'm filling within the government. That's what our plans ultimately often say. We do have a local hazard mitigation plan. It's part of the county's plan. And if people were interested in that, it's a good information source on what we see as the major threats. So as you're planning, it's a good spot to go start to look at what do the experts say I need to be worried about. It's very overwhelming, and it's very visceral as to a response most people have, particularly to fire. What I would tell people is the first thing is have a conversation with your family. Start talking about what does it mean if we have to evacuate? What are we going to do? What are we going to take with us? And have that conversation now. You know, today it happens to be raining and snowing out. Have that conversation now. Don't wait until the middle of fall when we're in the highest part of our fire danger to be having that conversation. It took many years, and as long as I've been in this business, for my wife to have that conversation, and she's finally realized, hey, I need to have a plan. That plan has to entail getting out of the area, but what do we take? What are we going to do? Go to the websites, the Ready, Set, Go, the readyforwildfire.gov, all the different websites that are out there, and figure out what the best way is for you to plan and for you to meet your needs. Do you have pets? Do you have kids? What have you done with your papers? But that starts with the discussion of, we just might have to leave, and what do I need to do? So most of the vegetation management stuff is going to come out of, for us, Truckee Fire Protection District, which we're fairly lucky in that the Truckee Fire Protection District covers all of the town, really covers a lot of the area from the Highway 80-20 split coming all the way back to state line. So they have a huge area that they cover. And the importance of that is that their district is able to do some things that maybe other ones haven't done, where they have some actual ordinances in place about vegetation management, defensible space. It mirrors the Public Resources Code, but they enforce it. They have a very high profile program for doing inspections, and when people aren't compliant, they actually can go back and write them citations, and if it gets to that point, they can actually clean it up and lien the property. Obviously, that's not the way we want to start, but that is a little bit different than a lot of places where we can't get that kind of compliance. They're also putting in a campfire ban this summer, so there'll be no outdoor burning of wood and charcoal type products. That's going to be quite different. And they're working on a ordinance with that's going to affect the sale of homes, where there'll have to be a defensible space inspection and paperwork that goes back and forth, so that if somebody's buying a house, that they know that that defensible space has been done. A lot of different things where we're really being much more proactive in kind of on the enforcement side, but really it's also important. That's why we have our Firewise, we have our prevention officers that want to come out and show you how to fix your property so that we don't have to go down those roads. Much easier if you do it ahead of time. Like I said, a really strong green waste program. So if you are into cleaning up your yard, which you should be, then there's avenues to dispose of all the materials that are coming from that. Right, so a little bit different in Truckee, and that is that we have a system called Nixle. There's a lot of different public alerting systems out there. We just happened to build our system around Nixle many years ago. The systems do make it somewhat difficult to transfer in between, so it's not like we could just switch to code red, which is what the county uses. And the Truckee Basin in itself is a little bit different in that we have Truckee Fire Protection, we have Truckee Police Department, we have a slice of Placer County, and we also have North Star. And we all try and work and Nevada County, into our notifications. The reality is it's going to come from all of those places. But what we want our citizens to do is sign up for something like Nixle, and it's pretty easy. Pound 888-777 in your zip code, and you can sign up for a Nixle alert in the Truckee area. And if you don't even live there, you can still sign up for it. The advantage to that is we're obviously trying to target our second homeowners. But more importantly, we're giving you information that's situational awareness. We want to tell you ahead of time, today's the day you need to really be worried. Research has shown that in all our large mega fires, while we may not have been able to predict where that fire started, we certainly knew the conditions were conducive for that fire to start. And those are not often, it's not every day in Truckee, it's actually a very minimal number of days that we have those kind of conditions. But on those kind of days, those are the days you need to have a full fuel tank, have your car backed into the driveway, make sure that your cell phones are charged, you're listening to the radio, your multiple communication media sources that we're going to be putting information out on so that we can give you the best and most up-to-date information. So the first warning you're getting is not your cell phone going off with that high-level wireless alert. By the time that happens, we really want you to already have known everything that we could tell you. Right, so for evacuations, we have about 1,200 total bed spaces if we were able to open up all the shelter we have. And that would mean that it was not affected by a fire because we're talking about the whole town. And we only have 1,200, whereas we have a full-time population of about 16,000 that swells to 30 to 40,000 with tourists. So we certainly don't have enough shelter space. So as a part of what we've done is I work with both Nevada County Office of Emergency Services and Washoe County Office of Emergency Services in Reno to push people out to Reno, Sacramento, down the hill, as you said. Primarily, most people are probably going to be going towards Reno. And the good thing there is relatively you have hotels and other things. So, shelters are not the most comfortable spot in the world. But we have a really good working relationship with the Washoe County Emergency Manager. We will send people there and they will set up shelters for us. Little known fact, the Red Cross Western Supply Depot is in Sparks. So we have as many shelter supplies as we could possibly need. It's just a matter of being able to get that all set up. And what we find is really we don't need as many as we would think we need, but we will need to get people out of that area. We just don't have the infrastructure to support people staying in town on that large scale event. Again, everything in some reality. That's, much smaller ones are what we deal with on a, unfortunately, more routine basis. I think it depends on where we're at in the evolution of whatever is going on. Early on, it's staying informed by looking at the weather sites, whatever one you want to use. I mean, there's plenty of private ones out there. There's WeatherBug Underground, there's weather.com. I personally say that it's best to go to the National Weather Service because they're the ones that are really pushing out the red flag warnings. And you'll hear about fire weather watch, red flag warnings. And we now have a new one in the Truckee that's coming out of Reno. The Reno Weather Service office is particularly dangerous situations. So a red flag coupled with a particularly dangerous situation will be for us overnight winds. Very unusual that we see overnight winds. It's just not something that typically happens there. So those are the kind of things ahead of time to be able to be aware of. Once we're kind of into an event where things are starting to happen, the town website, townoftruckee.com, will have information. The police department will have information. We have a very active social media, both us and the local CHP office. So those are places where you can expect to see up-to-date information. It may be that you're finding your information from your friends and neighbors. And so be willing to listen to them so long as it makes sense to what you're seeing. That's very difficult because we really don't know how to vet that news out. But if your neighbor's knocking on your door telling you to leave, it's probably a good idea to leave. They may know something. And so those different sources of information, and there's just literally people will probably be inundated with information. And one place that we're looking at and we're still working through all this is the emergency alert system. You know, sometimes the oldest stuff works good. And so when you start seeing the scrollers on TV or you hear it on the radio, that's pretty good information because it's coming from us directly. And people are going to pick it up, whether it's NCTV, whether it's TTC TV in Truckee. There's all sorts of different places, but those kind of updates are going to come out similar to the wireless alert. They're just longer messages so that we can get more information in. So really the biggest thing is be willing to turn on your TV, radio. If you are in an area that cell phones don't work, you probably really ought to think about making sure you have a landline. I know a lot of people have gone away from landlines, but at the end of the day, reverse 911 still does work very well. So having that landline option, and if you happen to have internet service, whether it's VoIP or some of the other ones, you can register that through your company back into those 911 systems. So those are good sources of information. The biggest thing is be willing to go out and look for the information. Yeah, so one of the things that we're looking at, we have a couple of different things we're doing. First thing is you know, as we really try and move to reducing our carbon footprint, we're trying to reduce the number of vehicle trips, and a lot of people are coming, you know, to vacation, and they're not coming with vehicles. So one of the things that we have is we actually have, we use it for some of our downtown events, the Truckee Thursdays bus schedule, or we also used it for our holiday periods where we actually ran bus service into our subdivisions, which is unusual. We don't normally do that. But we'll use that as a foundation for getting people to public transit. So the idea would be that we use the same map we use for those and use buses that we have locally available to us to run into those subdivisions where we can safely do that. So that's one of the kind of people that don't have transportation issues. For some of our access and functional needs, our elderly population, we're partnering with our senior services, senior center and senior services, High Sierra Seniors, and we're also partnering with our Meals on Wheels program. And I'm reaching out to our hospital, and this is really an unfortunate thing, but their home health care and their hospice, because you know those people still have needs. And so we're looking at those lists to make sure that we can put them onto a map layer and start looking at our subdivisions where we may have people who we need to go specifically check on. We're lucky that list is not huge. The other part of that is going to be an outreach to those folks to make them understand that really public safety can't be their first response in evacuations. They need to be thinking about friends, neighbors, family. What can we do to set up a plan for them if they have to leave? And for those folks, it may be that if it's a red flag day, they really do need to go somewhere else just because. And it's unfortunate, but those are the things we're seeing, and those are the people that are most affected by these fires. So this is one of those conversation pieces that's really difficult, because we probably need to change our focus from what's my last ditch thing I do to being at the front of the pack. In the fire service and in any of the public safeties we use, it we call temporary refuge areas. And what we're talking about there is where a firefighter or somebody in public safety has become trapped, and they're going to go, and quite honestly, they're probably going to get hurt. If they're lucky enough to have a fire shelter, they may not get hurt seriously. But this is a life and death situation. So when we're talking about that, that's the last step of this whole process. What we want is people to leave. Leave early, be at the front of the pack, get out, and don't rely on the idea that I might be able to go wait at the golf course, or I might be able to wait in the middle of a parking lot. Because when you get there and there's 600 other people waiting with you, it's not going to be a comfortable situation. If we are talking about an absolute last-ditch situation, and likely this is going to come from where a fire starts within a subdivision on a very windy day, and it blows up very dramatically in a very big hurry, trapping the first wave of people. In that case, if you've done defensible space, your house is probably your best place to stay. If you've hardened your house, if you've cleaned your pine needles off your roof, if you've done all that work, it's probably the best place to stay. It's going to be uncomfortable. There's a lot of things you need to go out and look at some of the literature about how to safely go through that. But the idea being that your house is going to take a little while to burn down, and the flame front is going to have passed, and you can then leave your house. That's a very unfortunate, very difficult conversation. And too many people, unfortunately, are thinking in the mindset of, I didn't get all my stuff and I'm not leaving, when in reality, they need to have gotten out. They need to get out early. And when we're giving evacuation warnings prior to even the orders, they need to be leaving so that they don't get stuck having to use that temporary refuge area. For anybody that's been through that kind of a situation, you realize just how significant that can be. And for the most part, we should be able to get people out that aren't in that first initial little spot where it blows up and it started big. We have a lot of time. I shouldn't say we have a lot of time. What we found in researching is we have time to make notifications, and people get out. It gets crazy getting them out, but they need to be thinking to leave. Change the mindset from what do I do if to I'm going to leave and I'm going to be at the front of the pack. And it's, could there be a chance when somebody gets trapped? Yes. And for that, if you're at your house is probably your best place to stay. Certainly being in a vehicle is not comfortable. Even if you're in a wide open space, it's probably not comfortable. It's flammable. All that stuff becomes very uncomfortable. And that's not the place you want to be. If we can get people to understand that it's leaving is a good idea. And really, truthfully, in most of, even when there's been large loss of life, we've been pretty successful at getting people out. If they just follow that kind of common sense, there's smoke and flame, I got to get out of here. It's going to be uncomfortable, and something that big is uncomfortable. So we have to be ready for it, but conceptually, we want to leave. It's very hard to think about leaving your stuff and picking what your items you're going to take, and things like pets and what do you do with your animals, and all that kind of stuff that has to be addressed ahead of time. If you're trying to think about it when the fire happens, it's just too crazy. Right. So the biggest thing is, once there's an evacuation order and you've left, do not return until we set it up so we can get you back in safely. Do not go back just to see if your house is okay. Do not try and walk in. Do not try and ride your bike in. Do not try and drive in. And what we found in all of our large fires, and even in the smaller ones, I mean, a couple hundred acres, and maybe it hasn't even burned any houses, but it's still, an active fire area, is that people are trying to get back in, and we're spending all our time trying to keep them out because of the dangers. Down power lines, there may still be hot, energized, natural gas, propane gas tanks that are still cooking off. All the stuff that we keep in our houses that has a chance of exploding and blowing up, and cleaning chemicals and everything else that needs to be safely dealt with. One of the things that we found in the Paradise Fire is that the culverts are made of plastic. They got warm, and the ground would hold until you drove over them. And people and trucks and things were falling into these culverts. People were getting stuck. All of a sudden, we have a totally different situation. Some of these areas burn over so fast, and fire doesn't burn everything. It may reignite. So we don't want people to go back in until we're ready. In a fire where we're talking that kind of size, there's going to be what's called an incident management team. And part of that team is they'll bring a lot of people to bear to help us, but they're going to set up how to stage reentry. And we're going to work with people to make sure we can get them back in to see what's there and to look at their property. But at the same time, we got to protect them, and we also have to protect their property, because everybody worries about looting, and for good reason. But if we're running around trying to chase people out, we don't know whether you're a looter or whether you live there. And certainly you know what you are, but that doesn't mean we know. So we're going to have kind of a staged process to get people back in. And as difficult as it is, it's about having a little bit of patience, making sure we sign up with the Red Cross and we're at the shelters, and going to the public meetings and figuring out how we're going to do that process to get people back in, because we may not be able to allow them to return to all of the area at once. We may have to stagger in. Many of the areas we evacuate may not actually have ever burned, but we evacuate them because we believe they would. So it takes time, unfortunately. I think the biggest thing is, and I've heard this touched on in a lot of different ways, and Truckee, we have the winter snows, and people watch the weather and all their winter activities, and they pay a lot of attention. And then we get the summer, and they kind of move away from that. Really, I think the biggest thing we can do is understand that chances are you're going to have advanced warning that some sort of event could occur. And so that means if you are seeing that the winds are up, it's dry weather and the winds are up, that should change your behavior. You should make sure you have a full tank of gas. I hear from our locals all the time, well, gas is so expensive, I don't keep my car full, I go to Reno. And you might want to pay the extra money when that day happens if you're low on fuel. You don't want to take a chance on running out of fuel. You want to make sure you have some devices, whether it's the scanner, the NOAA weather radio, whether it's making sure your phone is charged fully. A lot of people don't leave their phones on overnight. If it's a red flag day, and we're talking about overnight red flag warnings, you got to have your phone on. That's going to be the way you're probably going to get notified. And unfortunately, well, some of the population, how do you make sure you can hear that phone? And so you need to address these things so that when it comes time, this is not a surprise to you. You should have that information ahead of time, right? The Weather Service will typically know 48 to 96 hours out that we're going to be into a high fire, and they'll be calling it a fire weather watch. Usually somewhere in the 24 to 48 hour, probably closer to 24 hours, they're going to change it to a red flag warning. That pretty much means it's going to happen. And that's when you need to decide what your comfort level is. I know I've talked to plenty of people who probably are going to leave at that point because they just are that concerned. You have to decide what that level is for you, but you need to make an informed decision. And you need to be ready for that information. It is rare that we have very rare that we have a large mega fire where we didn't have the wind events predicted ahead of time. Something like the Paradise, where the winds are blowing through Jarbo Gap, the Santa Ana winds in Southern California, the Santa Rosa fires, even those winds out of the north. Those are unusual situations that the Weather Service is pretty good at predicting. We don't know where the fire is going to start, but we know that's the day you got to be worried.